Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 272, and it's Christmas Eve, and we're going to talk about Rand Paul's Festivus for the rest of us. So, if you're familiar with Rand Paul, you know that he's Ron Paul's son, senator in Kentucky. A lot of people are kind of lukewarm to him, but I like him a lot, obviously. I understand, uh, why his approach is different from his father. It is a senator as opposed to being a representative in the House. But I get it, and I understand how a lot of people want him to be more like his dad. But nevertheless, every year for the last 10 years, he has released a list of grievances, which he calls Festivus. And it's from a Seinfeld episode, Christmas episode, where one of the characters' father basically makes a list of how family members have disappointed him over the year. And it's supposed to be a very negative thing, but of course, Rand Paul has used it to air out his grievances against Congress for their overspending. Now, he does point out that big spenders are in both parties, Republicans and Democrats. And this year he came up with a list that has totaled about $1 trillion. And obviously, I think that there's much, much more. He knows there's much, much more. But here we go. I'm going to read through um, some of the things that he put on his list. And he basically explains the principle, right? So if the NIH, which is already wasting a lot of money now, gets their budget doubled for next year, well, then you can be uh, you know absolutely certain that the amount of waste will also increase, not double, but of course increase by a much, much higher margin. He also does point out that, just like Peter Schiff did, that Doge will not be able to stop it. They don't have that kind of legislative power where they can just end government programs, right? It's Congress that has to stop. It's Congress that has to stop, passing all these bills, which increases spending. And of course, if you didn't know by now, the way they do it is that they name some bill, like he mentions the CHIP Act, right? And it's supposed to be to develop the manufacturing of computer chips here in the United States. But of course, it's also full of pork, right? They'll entitle it that, but underneath it, they'll cram in lots of spending, and and that's where a lot of these agencies and bureaucrats, they get all this money, which they then waste, and they have to figure out new and more crazy ways to spend all of this money, and generally they succeed in doing so. Right, because if you have money left over at the end of the year, you won't get a budget increase, right? Because you don't need it. You didn't spend all the money you got this year, so why should we increase your budget? You get the idea. And so, of course, they have to spend as much money as possible. They have to spend all of the money that they got this year in order to have an increased budget the next year. And of course, that means a lot of waste, because that's just simply how the government works. So here are a couple examples. The National Endowment for the Arts funded ice skating drag queens for $10,000, which might not seem like a lot, but they also earmarked $365,000 for promoting city park circuses. There was also, let's see, $32,000 for breakdancing. Okay. Additionally, the Department of the Interior invested in the construction of a brand new pickleball complex for $12 million. Ooh, I could use $12 million. Department of the Interior also spent $720,000 for wetland conservation projects for ducks. You might say, well, I like ducks, but for the ducks in Mexico, right? So it's wetland conservation in Mexico. The Department of State Let's see, they have $2.1 million for border security and Paraguay. So all the things that might, you know, should be spent here in the United States. No, 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 we'll spend it overseas. $3 million for girl-centered climate action in Brazil. Ghost towns are also being maintained by the federal government for $10 billion. Okay, and the buildings are all empty. The Department of Health and Human Services spent $419,000 to determine if lonely rats see cocaine more than happy rats. Okay. I wonder how much the people who ran that experiment actually got paid. I mean, seriously, the Department of Energy spent $15.5 billion to push Americans towards electric vehicles, right? And so this is how you have more electric vehicles on the road than you would normally have, and it's because there are incentives, tax breaks, right? So you buy an electric vehicle, you put it as a tax write-off, and so the vehicle essentially becomes free. They did this with SUVs not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, probably longer, maybe 20 years ago, where SUVs, no one were buying them anymore because they were huge gas guzzlers. So what they did was they said, well, if you buy an SUV for your business, then you can basically, uh, declare it a write-off at the end of the year. And so I think my brother did that, and he essentially gets his SUV for free. He just has to pay for the gas for it and make sure that his lease doesn't go over a certain amount of mileage per year. And then the Department of State spent nearly $5 million on influencers in Ukraine. The Department of Agriculture spent $20 million on Fertilize Right initiative to advance fertilizer use in Pakistan, Vietnam, Colombia, and Brazil. Okay, a lot of this money going overseas. You don't know how it's being spent. And obviously, there are people struggling here in America. The Department of State is spending $123,000 to teach Kyrgyzstan youth how to go viral with their videos. The Navy spent $90 billion on LCS vessels, and it stands for littoral combat vessels. They're supposed to be like very low radar profile, hard to detect. They're supposed to be the next generation of U.S. Navy stealth vessels, but the Navy calls them LCS, little crappy ships. Um, And I looked them up, and one Navy secretary and his allies in Congress fought to build more littoral combat ships, even as they broke down at sea and their weapon systems failed. The Navy wound up with more ships than it wanted, and at a lifetime cost that would reach $100 billion or more just to maintain and fix these ships. The Navy's haste to deliver ships took precedence over combat ability. Without functioning weapon systems, the vessels are like uh, boxes floating in the ocean. Sailors and officers complained that they spent more time fixing the ships than actually sailing them. The stress led many to seek mental health care. Top Navy commanders placed pressure on subordinates to sail the ships, even when the crews and vessels were not fully prepared to go to sea. And all of us who are familiar with the sea, the ocean, knows that it's pretty dangerous out there. And if your crew is not properly trained, then you will have a disaster. So that was some of the things that I chose to highlight from the Festivus list. And it's crazy, right? 90 billion. I mean, and he didn't talk about the F-35, but that's probably coming close to $2 trillion of waste right there alone. And no one is willing to admit that it was a huge waste. So Milton Friedman said, nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Nobody uses somebody else's resources as carefully as he uses his own. So if you want efficiency and effectiveness, if you want knowledge to be properly utilized, you have to do it through the means of private property. In other words, if it's not yours, stop trying to take it so you can waste it. Okay. Uh, if you note, and so basically Milton Friedman tried to inform everybody, educate everybody about this government waste. He also said nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program, basically talking about how government programs never die. They just get re-upped, right? And so we're still paying farmers recovery money for the Great Depression of the 1930s. That's still ongoing, believe it or not. And so you realize that a lot of this government funding just simply creates dependency. It's not really about recovery. It's not really about helping people. Okay. It's not that at all. Also, notice that the funding follows political agenda, not information. It's not a pursuit of information like the National Science Foundation, funding, lonely rats, and before they've talked about, and they have this obsession with drugs, right? Cocaine, especially cocaine squirrels, they do this all of the time. And I'm sure they'll justify it by saying we're trying to help drug addicts, but in reality, it's just wasteful spending, right? Just, end the drug war, and then we don't have to worry about this any longer. I've talked about government funding science as a problem, right? Because it's people who are in charge of not their money, right, but bent on trying to spend on anything. And so basically, if you submit a funding request, a funding idea, which somehow seems to foster the overall greater political agenda, then it's going to get money. Okay. And this is really a bad situation. I've talked about how government funding ruins academic conferences as well. Well, I would always, for a while, for a time, like 10 years in a row, I think, I submitted paper proposals for these big academic conferences. Sometimes I got it, but once I figured out the kind of paper I was submitting, then I never got approved any longer. And I would look at the papers that were being approved, and you also see the prompt, right? Like we're seeking papers about this or that. And they are all political, right? So it's a religion conference, and they're seeking paper proposals on climate change, right? Why? Well, because there's a political agenda behind it, right? They want everyone on board, and the money is available to do so. So when you submit topics based on a certain expectation, you're basically engaging in rent seeking, which means that there far more time and energy is wasted than what is actually what you get in return. But also the whole process contributes to the moral hazard of government spending, twisted incentives, and also continued generational waste. So Rand Paul was saying how, or someone was mentioning how it was over the last 50 years since the 1970s, with inflation and coming off the gold standard. I'm sure that's what was being implied. 50 years of waste. But the 1888 Congress was called the Billion Dollar Congress. Right, 1888 was a long time ago, but it was after the Civil War. And what was happening is all of these revenue generators that were installed for the purpose of funding the Civil War, they sort of hung around for a while, particularly tariffs. And so the revenue one year was really, really high. And basically, people were like, well, what do we do with this money? And the decision was made that they have to spend it all within a year. And in 1888, $1 billion is a huge amount of money. But they managed to do it. And the way they were able to do it was they basically said that they were going to help Civil War veterans. But of course, the qualification for qualifying to be a Civil War veteran was very low. So it wasn't that you necessarily had to see combat. You could have been just in the middle of training when the war ended, but you would could be considered a veteran. You would qualify for all these benefits and stuff. And so it was very controversial, but of course it has become forgotten. And people don't realize that this wasteful government spending has at least happened for 150 years. So it's a national security risk. We have to realize, Peter Schiff says this all the time, but this waste, this is a national security risk. We are not, as a country, careful with how the country spends its resources. Plus, where does all this money come from? And it's debt, yeah. And so each American is sitting, each share of, for each American, no matter how old they are, right? It could be an infant, a newborn is sitting on $106,000 of debt each, right? Each of us are doing that, are sitting on that. That's ours. It's criminal, right? It's criminal behavior. I wouldn't spend my money this way, but of course, Congress gets away with doing it by calling it the Patriot Act, or calling it, the CHIP Act, or, Save Our Kids Act. I mean, whatever. They're going to come up with a catchy name, a name that will become unpopular to your constituents if you are seen as voting against it. And people don't care about all the pork that is also in that bill. And this is how they do it. This is how waste just simply increases. And it's criminal, right? They are stealing our money and then wasting it. Every year, Rand Paul has done this Festivus thing, and few people care. In fact, the Festivus creator, the person who came up with the idea of Festivus for the Seinfeld show, he hates Rand Paul, right? And what he said, the reason why he hates it is because he hates politicians and their misuse of his ideas, right? How they co-opt and misappropriate ideas. But he's actually using it properly, right? And it's no cost to the creator, unlike what Congress does to everybody. And it's such a crock that the Festivus creator hates Rand Paul for his proper use, which has no financial blowback against him. If anything, it increases people's curiosity that they'll Google Festivus and the Seinfeld show. Well, we'll see if more people are going to pay attention to this, if Doge has any kind of effect in raising awareness and, ending this madness. I do know that it's more likely than not that all of this will come to an end when the dollar loses value. And then all of us will really be in it. And I hope you know what I mean by that. But otherwise, it's Christmas Eve, and I hope that all of you have a very Merry Christmas. I will release an episode tomorrow, appropriate for Christmas. I don't think I have a standalone episode for it, but I will have an episode tomorrow. Just to get back into the rhythm of things after missing a lot of episodes because of my voice. But anyway, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and whatever holiday you celebrate, I hope you have a wonderful time, and I will talk to you next time.